Hello, welcome back. My name is Maurizio.
My name is Zaya, and this is day three
Three.
of Talks on Trauma series.
Mhm.
Um, and next, we have a very special guest with us today, Juo. Juo is a singer, songwriter, actor, poet, mental health expert,
Yeah.
and we just finished listening to her incredibly beautiful, tender, human, heartbreaking book, Never Broken.
Yeah, beautiful book.
Yeah.
So, Jewel, she has an amazing story. Jewel went from being a girl who grew up with no running water on an Alaska homestead to a homeless teenager in San Diego to an award winning multi platinum recording artist who released one of the best selling debut of all time. Through her career, Jewel has sold over 30 million albums worldwide, earned 26 music award nominations. Mental health and mindfulness has been a lifelong passion of Jewel, and she offers free mindfulness exercise and an online mental health community at jewelneverbroken.com.
Welcome, Joe, and welcome, Gabor.
Yes, this is going to be awesome. Such a joy to have you here. Thank you.
Well, first of all, my 32-year-old daughter would like you to know that when she was 8 years old and she went to summer camp and felt terribly homesick, the counselor would sing your song, You Were Meant for Me, every night to relax her and to help her go to sleep. So she's very grateful for that.
That's very sweet.
And recently I listened to your song, No More Tears, and about homelessness. And it's just piercingly beautiful. It really is heartbreakingly beautiful. That's so thank you. I'd like to begin with the interview with, not with your story, which I want to go back to, but with something that you learned. And you learned so much, and you teach so much in your book. But towards the end of the book, you have this long poem of yours, The Infinite Ache. At the end of it, you say, for you're pregnant with yourself. Can you just speak those lines? Do you remember those lines to speak them to our audience?
I don't recall those lines. I can look really quick to see if I can find them in my.
Well, I have them here, if you like.
Oh, good. Yeah. What are they?
For you're pregnant with yourself, a new you, and it has its own gestation period because you cannot force nature, only nurture it. So, can you just talk about that? Because it's all about everybody's listening here is wanting to get born as their true selves. And that's what you're addressing in those lines.
Yeah, I wish I could remember the entire poem. I moved out when I was 15, and I was really struck with this idea of nature versus nurture. And if I received poor nurture, would I ever get to know my nature? Or was I already programmed? Was it over, so to speak? Which is a really depressing thought to think when you're 15. I knew that as much as I had a genetic inheritance, I also had an emotional inheritance, this emotional language that had been passed on generationally. And we had a bunny named Caramel when I was young, and it was raised with chickens.
No,
And
Caramel played with the chickens.
it did.
Yeah.
And it thought it was a chicken, and it would peck at food, and it would waddle.
Yeah.
And it would actually lay on the nests for the hens, and it would hatch the eggs for the hens.
Yeah.
And it was very cute until I moved out when I was 15 and realized, what if I'm a bunny that was raised by chickens? And what if I never get to know my real bunny nature?
Mm.
And it was terrifying. And I wanted to see if there was a way to get to know my authentic self beneath the programming that I had received, the neural programming. Those words weren't around then, neural programming and those things, but the idea of nature versus nurture was, and it, through just curiosity and introspection and writing, it led me on this journey. And I had a lot of death in my life. Not, I didn't die, but a lot of letting go, a lot of emotional death, a lot of trauma. And I came to find a still point in, it's hard to put words to. I came to find a still point in death, a way to relax and dilate and open, and how it connects you to life in a new and profound way. And the blessing of it, of blessing, it's funny, it makes me tear up right now. The blessing of a good death, of letting go, of trusting death, of trusting nature, of trusting that process, of allowing that grief and that wave and that darkness and the comfort in it. Oddly, I was able to find a real comfort there instead of resisting it. And then I'm very visual, and so I would begin to see this sort of glimmering on a horizon in this really dark space. And I was struck with the idea that, death and life hold hands, and you can't have one without the other. And so just as I'm dying, as I was writing this poem, and that book was after a divorce, there was also a part of me being born. And so you have one foot in each world. And so there would be days I would just tend to my death. And then there would be days I would get very curious about what my next life was, and realizing that the quality of my death dictated the quality of my next life, emotionally, of course.
It's, it's interesting you should say. It's interesting you should say that because I'm just writing a new book, and I actually ended up having just discovered your book, but I right away I grabbed a passage from it, which I'll quote to you later, that I'm going to cite in my own book. But in writing this book, I talked to a woman who was diagnosed with terminal uterine cancer. She was told she had a few months to live. That was over 20 years ago. And she actually began to write a book about dying well. But turns out she didn't die. And what she found out was that in order to live well, you have to know, no, in order to die well, you have to know how to live well. So the two are completely holding hands, just as you say. And in finding out how to die well, her uterine cancer spontaneously went away.
It's, there's, I don't mean to drive the conversation. I'll let you ask another question, but yeah, it brings up so many things.
Go ahead, please. I want to hear your thoughts.
Um, so when I did pretty good when I was 15. I moved out and was paying rent. I started having panic attacks when I was 16. I didn't know what they were. I didn't know what, there was no word for them that I knew of at that time. They continued. I began to kind of find these ways, again, through kind of introspection, of getting myself out of them, and then even realizing I could ask myself questions, which was an amazing process. And then I ended up in San Diego and wouldn't have sex with a boss, and started living in my car, and my car got stolen, and I was homeless, and my panic attacks turned into agoraphobia and shoplifting. I was shoplifting a lot,
Beginning with carrots.
beginning with carrots. I was very interested in the toll that the stress was having on my body. I was beginning to have kidney infections and chronic bladder infections, and I wanted to understand food as medicine. And again, those words weren't around then. It was so hard. I know it's hard for people to imagine now, but like the late 80s and early 90s, there was not the internet, and finding out things was very difficult.
Yeah.
And so I was trying to understand which vitamins and minerals helped, mucosa linings and inflammation and those types of things. And so I was very into healthy eating. So while I was homeless, I was shoplifting organic food, because if you're going to steal something, you might as well make it healthy. um,
For the bladder, you need cranberries.
Not just, like marshmallow root and things that help, build after so many infections, the bladder lining gets rough,
Yeah.
and no longer smooth. And so finding things that help build
Mm.
mucosa linings, not just dealing with the pH balance, which is sort of, what cranberry juice is doing. But anyway, um, I was stealing a dress one day, and I looked at myself in the mirror and realized my big goal at 15, moving out, of not wanting to be a statistic. I was a statistic. I didn't beat the odds, so to speak. And I remembered this quote that not all, let's see, happiness doesn't depend on who you are or what you have. It depends on what you think.
Mm.
And so I decided to see if I could turn my life around one thought at a time. But I had so much chronic anxiety, I couldn't perceive my thoughts in real time because I was just disassociating all the time. And so I had this little hack of I decided that your thoughts are cooled down and slowed down into action, and your hands have to actuate thought. So maybe I could see what I was thinking by studying what my hands did all day. And so I
Mm.
started taking notes for 2 weeks. I just wrote everything down that my hands did. I had no idea what I was looking for. It was just the only thing I could think of to do. And at the end of 2 weeks, I looked back at what I wrote, and there were, some takeaways. I quit believing in myself and some things like that. But the much more interesting thing was that my panic attacks had gone away, and I hadn't noticed that my
Mm.
panic attacks had gone away till I sat down, and it was a massive side effect that I wasn't expecting of this little 2 week study of watching my hands. And what I had stumbled onto was presence.
Yeah.
Again, I don't think I remember hearing that word at the time, but what I had stumbled onto was that my worry was a thief, and it was causing me to project a past experience onto a future that hadn't happened. And it was kind of like if I wanted to keep my house safe, it was like leaving my house to go look for burglars. When I had to stay in my house to keep myself safe, I had to be in the actual moment. And that moment was the only chance I had of actually keeping myself safe and advocating for myself. And
Yeah.
that discovery was very exciting to me. And so I began taking more and more notes and studying more and more just within myself. And one of the things I noticed is that there were only two basic states of being I had, and that was it. There was two basic states, and it was dilated or contracted.
Mm.
And then I realized every single thought, feeling, or action led to one of those two states. And so I began to keep track in my notebook. I had a section for dilated and a section for contracted. And then I
By
had three subsections of,
by dilated, do you mean expanded, expansion,
yeah, expansion.
expansion or yeah?
Yeah. Um, I use dilated just because I think of, yeah, birthing and breathing, but yeah, all the same thing. Um, and so I had thinking, feeling, and doing. And so for a month, I just wrote down every time I was able to notice in my body when I felt relaxed, open, dilated, expanded. I would write down immediately what was I just thinking, feeling, or doing. And then every time I felt tight, contracted, body posture turned inward, I would write down what was I thinking, feeling, or doing. And I noticed a real pattern. And that was my internal dialogue. And that was it was a cheat sheet, I guess. It was a way of coming to know myself better.
Well,
And
allow me to interrupt for a moment. When I read your biography, which is really a luminous piece of writing, I just love the sheer language of it. You know, um, it was almost like I was watching a double consciousness. There was that inner self that, from a very young age, and you seemed to be quite aware of what was going on, and even seemed to be aware that you are not what you were acting out, and you were writing all that stuff down. So there was that awareness that seemed to somehow either possessed you or you possessed it from a very early age on. And at the same time, there was this person who was confused and dissociated and traumatized and gets into all kinds of trouble that they unwittingly generate for themselves. And the book is almost like the two eventually coming together so that the awareness and the consciousness becomes dominant, becomes the one in charge. Is that an act? But it's unusual to see that presence and that awareness arise at such an early age. Does that, am I describing something that you're recognizing in yourself? Because I'd love to have your comments on that. Because most people don't seem to be that self-aware as you seem to have been. And you used to write it down. It's almost like you had a double life. The life that you lived and the life that you wrote to yourself privately.
no, yes, that it does feel that way. It did feel that way. When I was young, it made me feel pretty crazy. I sort of had existential crises, however you say that word, when I was young. I remember sitting in church, and my older brother was 8, I was 5, and he was in a play, and it was all 8-year-olds. And to denote which 8-year-old was a boss, they wore a tie. And to denote which 8-year-old was a farmer, they wore overalls. And to denote which 8-year-old was a mom, they wore a little house dress. And the babies would wear diapers and things. But they're all the same age. And for some reason, it really, really freaked me out. I remember looking down the pew at my parents and realizing everybody was just acting and we're all the same. And it sent me into a real fit. I had a real, I guess you might even say, a depression. I don't know if that's possible to have at that age, but I remember feeling like I popped out of life. I popped out of reality, and I didn't know how to connect again for quite a while. I remember a very, I don't know if you would say disassociative, but watching soccer games and being part of life later in the day, later in the week, and not knowing how to tie into how what was real. Nothing felt real. And that type of thing would happen to me from time to time, which was difficult. When it served me in a lot of ways. I was observant. And so when I was bar singing at 8, I saw that people were in pain, and I saw that people didn't know what to do with pain. And I could tell it was pain. And they were drinking or raging or engaging in sex or whatever it was. And nobody outran it. And I knew
Right.
that I was in pain
What
because my parents say
there's a one,
again.
sorry, there's a wonderful phrase in your book about you can't outrun pain. You can't
Yeah.
pain, and we all try to, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah. It was such a gift that I saw that moment and realized I was in pain, and my dad had just began being abusive. And I made myself a promise to never drink or do drugs, and I made myself a promise to try and deal with it as it came. And if I didn't know what to do with it, I would put a pin in it. And writing helped. Writing put me in a state that just took the edge off the pain enough that it was tolerable. And then this fascinating thing happened is when I wrote, I I realized I observed things that I didn't realize I had observed.
Right.
Or I would understand or have an insight to my dad, maybe, or something that I didn't realize before that moment. And so I really turned to writing as my medicator, if you will. And later, when I was about 14 or 15 and had read Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And then again, pop forward to when I was 18, starting to kind of have these deeper experiences of trying to understand who I was beneath this programming. I realized, it isn't that I think, therefore I am, it's I perceive what I think, therefore I am.
That's
I'm
right.
actually the observer, I'm not my thoughts. There's a gap between the observer, what I'm observing, and my action. And so the bigger I could make that gap,
Yeah.
when I could create a big pause, a big space between me observing and then cultivate observing better and better and building a bigger, stronger muscle for observing more consciously, more presently, more frequently, and then putting a pause before I created action, that was the image I had was a cocoon. Imagine a cocoon, like a chrysalis. And inside, I saw all these swirling colors. And outside is this sort of gray, papery chrysalis cocoon. I had begun to believe that I was the chrysalis, the outside, the wrapping.
Yeah.
And that wrapping is actually all of the ways I was taught to behave. It was personality forming in front of us while we grow, all around us while we're growing, while we're having misunderstandings about our childhood, while we're developing responses to core wounds and core misunderstandings. Our personality begins to form, our opinions about life and our world and ourselves begins to form, but it isn't real necessarily. It's just a lot of assumptions that I made when I didn't know much better,
Yeah.
and actions, that build neural pathways and build life and build actions. And so being able to be the observer, I was able to associate that I'm the colors inside. And that's where I'm able to look at nurture versus nurture and go, I can re-nurture myself.
Hmm.
Because as long as I start to learn how to act in accordance to the colors, my authenticity, as you would say too, then if I can have an experience of that, I had to create situations for me to have an experience of it. And then if I could form that into thoughts, feelings, and actions, my life would begin to be my own and not just a pre programmed neural reaction, but a formed response. And that's how I began to really change the trajectory of my life.
Now, even later on in your life, when it came to your marriage, you talked about how you were still caught up in the fantasy of love and belonging, too caught up in it to see the truth, so that this tension between our authenticity and our need to attach to somebody at the cost of sacrificing our authenticity, which goes back to very early childhood. That's just so difficult for a lot of people to recognize, and people still automatically go for the attachment at any cost. And in when I read your book, that seemed to show up very strongly, certainly in your relationship with your mom, and which we can talk about in a moment. But also in your career, you talked about that the more idolized you were, the more alone you felt. So the more you got this external adulation, really, the less yourself you seem to be. So can you talk about that tension between I need to be accepted and loved and even adored, and then listening to that small little voice that you also talk about in your book?
Absolutely. When I got signed to a record label, I was homeless, but I had just started figuring out the beginnings of a lot of what I'm talking about. And I'd started to be happy, like genuinely, really, really felt like I was building momentum and figuring something out that I really had needed to figure out. And I was excited. And I had just learned to write honestly. I realized a lot of, I call it brilliant resilience. A lot of the things that were my internal resources, like independence, saved me. It was a coping mechanism, you can say, that wasn't drugs. It was an internal resource that was a natural resource of mine. I was naturally independent. And it's why I had the courage to leave at 15. And it's why I had the courage not to be around other homeless kids, for instance, that I knew would be a bad influence on me. I didn't mind going out on my own. But it began to limit my ability to connect at all, to have joy at all. And so it became negative. My safety, gear became destructive. And so I started writing honestly, really honestly. I started singing really honestly, very emotionally. Like I hid my whole life in plain sight. Um, I would never let anybody know I was hurt or in pain, ever. That was too scary. So my healing was my writing, that I was going to share this with people. And then it turned into me getting discovered accidentally. I wasn't trying to get signed. And then I almost didn't sign the record deal because I was afraid, because I knew I had a lot of emotional trauma and baggage. And that if you take somebody like me and you make them famous, it's, another statistical stereotype. Uh, and I didn't want to be a statistic.
So
So I almost didn't sign the deal.
are you saying that you were aware of that even then?
Yeah. Yeah. I was
Wow.
very aware of it. Very, very, very afraid of it. Like more like I feared it for sure, which was smart. It was like a good, smart, healthy dose of fear.
Yeah.
I didn't I wasn't the kid that thought fame would fix anything in my life. I already had enough experience of what I had been learning internally to know that's what was going to fix me. That was my path I needed to follow. And so I almost turned down my record deal, as odd as that sounds. I was on a beach one day and really was thinking about it. And I was compelled to do music because I felt like it was so healing and I loved it. And it was a job I loved, what a gift. But I knew the downsides and the potential dangers. And so I made myself a promise. And it was that my number one job was to learn how to be a happy, whole human, not a human full of holes. And that my number two job was to learn how to be a musician. And then number 2 had a subcategory. I knew I wanted to be an artist and not famous. That if I had to make a choice, I would always choose art. And so, having made that promise to myself, I went ahead and signed the deal. And I'm really proud to say at 47, it hasn't been perfect, but I've never let that commitment down. I never got them reversed. I took years between records. I did things that kill momentum and make record labels mad because I knew I couldn't psychologically handle the level of fame that I had gotten. And so, for some reason in my art, I just had the tension wasn't there that way. I knew I was built to serve. I knew I was built to serve humanity. I knew my job was in alignment with that. And I knew that that didn't mean I would become a good person or a happy person, and that I had to have a business plan, if you will, as robust, using all my intelligence and creativity, a plan around how do I become a happy human. Where I had the tension that you're talking about was much more in my personal relationships. Um, I never felt like fame made me a good person or liked or likable. Those things existed in another place. And it existed most with my mom, of course. And the thing with evolution, with evolving, with growing, with healing, I wish it was instantaneous, but it's not. We heal and we grow kind of the way a flower opens. It's a petal, and it's real. And it doesn't mean there's not more petals that won't open. And that'll continue my whole life, I'm sure. And there were some petals in there to yet to unfold that were pretty difficult.
Well, let's come then to your relationship with your parents, because the 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 trauma inflicted on you by your father is very open, very overt. He was an alcoholic, I think, and he was certainly physically abusive towards you. He beat you. With your mother, it's much more subtle, but much more insidious, it seems, and much more painful and much more difficult for you to liberate yourself from. In that, I mean, when I was reading the passages about you and your mom, and I'm not blaming her because she must have had her own emptiness and her own pain to behave that way. So it's not a judgment, but towards you, it's almost vampirical. It was like she was sucking the life force out of you because she didn't have any of her own. And so this thing that she said to you about how we're two bodies, but one soul, that's a frightening thing to say to a child at any age. So, and that was your deepest hurt, I think. I think you've made your peace with your dad, but with your mom, I think it's been much more corrosive and painful. Can you talk about those two kinds of traumas? That the one of them appeared in the guise of love and support and spiritual advice, and a lot of it that she gave you seemed to be very good spiritual advice. A lot of it was manipulative, but there was some good stuff in there. But at the same time, it was just poisonous. That's how it struck me.
Yes. Yeah, so my parents got divorced when I was 8. My mom left. We were a nice Mormon family prior to that, uh, somewhat idyllic. And I didn't know why my mom left. She had said somewhere along the line that my dad had blackmailed her to, I think that's in the book, to, because he wanted us, I guess, maybe to be vindictive.
Which turns
Right?
out not to be to have happened.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, and if I'd thought about it, it probably wouldn't have made sense because my dad didn't really seem like he wanted us. So it might not have held water, but when you're young, you can't quite think these things through.
sure.
But I missed my mom, immensely. It was very, very hard for me to be away from her. And so I would go through really extreme lengths to go be with her. Um, I would put ride lines out on the radio station up in Alaska saying, hey, somebody needs a ride to Anchorage from Homer, we'll split gas. And I would save up babysitting money or whatever I could to get a ride 250 miles to see my mom. My dad began, I didn't know the words trauma triggering, but he began trauma triggering at this time and began drinking and smoking, and began to be physically abusive pretty quickly right after the divorce. We moved away to Homer, Alaska. And so it was a real shock. My mom was this calm, quiet, I guess, victim, I thought, that the big, mean, bad guy took us away from. My dad was a really easy, obvious guy to not like or enjoy. He was volatile, he was abusive. And so I, of course, saw my mom as this sort of amazing person, which she was in a lot of ways. Um, And so there was many years of showing up on her doorstep, strange things happening, which I put in the book. Like she would say, your mind is incredibly powerful. Your mind can create health and dishealth, and we don't even know what all the mind is capable of. And, you can even learn to control the lights with your mind. And I want you to sit here and I want you to stare at this light and see if you can just get it to start to respond to your thoughts. That was her way of babysitting me. I didn't know that at the time. I felt incredibly special. Like, wow, she thinks I'm so powerful and so special, and she's training me. And I felt very loved. And really, it was just her leaving, I think, to go somewhere. And I felt like a failure when it didn't happen. Or, God, Lord forbid, nobody explained brownouts, and I actually thought I was getting somewhere. um, so my mom was always this, beautiful, soft, spiritual, artistic, brilliant person. Um, my dad was charismatic, talented, very bright himself, but easier to be mad at. Um, when I moved out at 15, I had been going back and forth. It's a long, convoluted story, but I think I counted once between the ages of 8 and 18, I had 22 different places I lived. So I was incredibly transient. And I moved out at 15. I was paying rent and getting myself through school. It was at my mom's suggestion. I had been living with her in Anchorage for a while. Some crazy stuff went down with, oh my Lord, it's just even too much to like, it's like you kind of can't believe it all happened in one life. But I was not looking forward to going back and living with my dad for the summer. And she said, why don't you just move out? And it was such a relief. I was like, that is the best idea. Like, can I just move out? Like, I could live in a cabin by myself or in a cabin with a guy who wasn't nice to me. And so I was really excited to move out and knew that I should turn out into a statistic and that I didn't want to, and was really excited about this proposition of not being a statistic. But mind you, my mom didn't say live with me, which didn't seem odd to me at the time. It seemed normal somehow. So flash forward, I get signed to a record deal. I'm in San Diego. My mom had been there. She left and went back to Alaska. And I called her. I got out of the ocean. I was surfing. I got on a payphone and I said, Mom, you won't believe it. There's record labels here to see me. And she says, I'll be right down to help you. And I felt so thankful. And, should have been a major red alert, but it just felt like my mom really loves me and she really cares me and she's going to come down and help me through a potential minefield of who knows what record labels are like. And so she did, and I got offered $1 million signing bonus, and I turned it down because I realized it was a loan. And if I wanted to choose art and not fame, it meant I had to parent my art well. And for some reason, I understood that concept really well, that I couldn't leverage or put myself in a position to have to leverage art because I come from nature. It's a seed. You can't make a seed grow fruit overnight. You have to give it room and conditions and time. That hardwood grows slowly. And so if I took too much money, I would be putting too much pressure on a seed. And I knew that for some reason really intuitively. And so I just took rent money. I took the biggest back end anybody had been given. And I got a house for my brother and my mom to live in. And I bought my mom a used car and me a used car with a little tiny advance I got. And I set out on my career. And all of my career decisions I had good instincts. But my real blind spot was my mom. And eventually she became a co-manager, and eventually she moved that manager out and became my full-time manager. I knew that fame wouldn't last forever and that I should start building things outside of music. And so we began doing that together. And it wasn't until I was probably 34 years old, something in there, 33, 34, that I realized that all my money was gone. And I had been looking at bank statements that weren't real.
But
And
not, but also your mother seemed to make you feel that your success was somehow her doing, and that, as you say in the book at some time, your success was just the tip of an iceberg, of which she made up most of the bulk of that underwater iceberg. So that not only did she take your money, she also seemed to deprive you of your sense of independent success.
yeah, the reason it took so long to explain the relationship with my mom, because it was, of course, over so many years, and it was such a unusual type of abuse. I think I'm no psychiatrist, but
Yeah,
beginning with the grooming when I was young, that there's two types of people: dreamers and warriors. My mom's a dreamer, I'm a warrior. That meant I was a doer, which sets you up for a very certain kind of role in someone's life.
yeah,
To later, when I was 16, her saying you're the same soul in two different bodies, which made me feel incredibly loved and claimed and owned for somebody that had such love sickness, like me. And then, later, her saying she was the source.
yeah. But
I was just the tip of the iceberg, very insignificant, just the face people saw. But
sorry to
she was
interrupt.
everything underneath. And that type of thing was,
Sorry to
there's three
interrupt.
examples.
Sorry to interrupt. But that statement, "we're two bodies with one soul." Can you even imagine saying that to your son, who lives in what's your son's name? Casa?
Case.
Case. Okay, sorry, Case.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what a toxic thing it would be to say to him?
Yeah.
That that he's not a separate individual, that he's, somehow some extension of you.
Yeah. It was a hell of a number that was done. And as you say, with my dad, when I learned more about my dad's childhood and the trauma of
Yeah,
his childhood, it was unimaginable. Like,
yeah,
unimaginable. So whatever happened to my mom, I assume was unimaginable.
yes,
But it doesn't. And I find this with people. People often are afraid to look at the trauma in their own lives, in their childhoods, with their parents, because we tend to be very either or, a black or white, very absolute.
yeah.
And it's not that my dad was all bad. He
Hmm.
wasn't. He's a great person. I don't think my mom's all bad. There's tremendous good I got from her, but it wasn't all good. And it doesn't mean you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a song I wrote called The Family Tree, but you need to be thoughtful about which seeds you carry forward, which
Yeah.
seeds you allow to continue to germinate in your body, and which seeds you will refuse. And it doesn't mean it's all bad. And just if there are people that are wanting to look maybe at their childhood but are afraid to, it doesn't mean that that person's all bad. And it's
Well,
hard for us to hold space for both, but both are true. It's kind of that, it's paradoxical, but that's life. It doesn't mean what my mom did to me was okay. Pretty sure there's a reason. And that if I hold bitterness or contempt for her, it's going to inhibit my healing.
hmm um, of course, you wrote this very beautiful song, "My Father's Daughter," um, which, I mean, in the video, you'll even show yourself yodeling along with your dad when you're, what, 4 or 5 years old, and it, it's hard to see that song except other than as a tribute to your dad, despite all the pain that he inflicted on you. So tell me how you made peace with all that.
Um, it's a lot of things. Trauma, to me, when I really sat down and sat in my body with it, it's what brought me to talking about dilation and contraction earlier.
Hmm.
I think trauma is an experience that's so overwhelming we can't understand it. And it's a massive dose of energy or information or experience that's so big we can't process it. And we typically will contract around it, and it'll stay in our system, and it calcifies, sort of. It gets stiff, it gets immobile. And then
Yes.
it begins to have all these interactions with our body chemistry, right?
Yes.
All the neurochemicals that get released, the cortisols that get released, and it stays in our system and it keeps irritating our system. And I realized it wasn't as much for me to forgive or not forgive. I mean, what a power trip to say, I am in the position of forgiving or not forgiving. It's kind of
Yeah,
a really funny power trip.
it is.
And I don't think has anything to do with anything. What I had to do was dilate, 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 dilate to get this energy to move in and through my system and to keep it moving
Yeah.
and to soften and open and soften and open and soften and open until I could understand and let this experience move through me
Mm.
and not hang on to it. And any feeling that causes you to contract around it will interfere with you opening big enough to let that energy, that experience move through you.
Mm.
You know, these experiences should change us. We don't
Mm.
get to choose how life changes. I didn't get to choose what my mom did. I didn't get to choose what my dad did. But I do get to choose how it changes me.
Which
And
is
that's
the
co creation. That's a powerful place that takes you out of being a victim.
absolutely.
And that takes you into an authentic power, not a power trip like I will not forgive you or I
Yeah.
shall forgive you. That's
Yeah.
an inauthentic form of control.
You know, it's I don't know if you're familiar with a psychotherapist in her 90s now. Her name is Edith Eger, Eger. Now, Edith was a Hungarian Jew like myself. She was born 16 years before I was, and she was taken to Auschwitz on the same train that my grandparents were. Now, she survived. They didn't. But now she's become a psychotherapist in the States, and she writes this book called The Gift, in which she goes and forgives Hitler. She goes to Berchtesgaden, which is Hitler's mountain retreat, and she forget not for his sake, but for her own, because she doesn't want to she doesn't want to be held in that contracted state. It's not a question of making okay what he did.
Mm-mm.
It's just a question of letting go of that contraction. Now, I want to come to the passage in your book that I actually cited in the manuscript that I'm now completing. And I just quoted to you. And I think it'd be so helpful if you talk to people about that. Your book is entitled Never Broken. And the phrase, the brokenness comes up twice. And I'd like to remind you of them and have you talk about it. One is at some point you say that my life has not been about fixing what is broken. It has been about it has been about engaging in a loving and tender archaeological dig back to my true self. So that's the one place we talk about rejecting or not dwelling on the brokenness. And the other is when you talk about much later in the book, you talk about the soul cannot be broken any more than water can be broken, any more than air can be split. Can you tell us what you've learned about all that?
Yeah. Honored, by the way, that you would cite that. I love your work. Um, I came. There's so much I'd love to talk about, and hopefully we can do this again. But I'll try and keep my scope narrow. I was coming at my healing as if I was broken and I had to fix myself, and that's a really depressing thought because most of us go to therapy and go to therapists and go to doctors thinking something is wrong with us,
Right.
that we're inherently bad, we're defective, we're a misfit. Shame, when we have a failing sense of worth, where we tend to go to that at a young age is something must be wrong with me,
Yes.
right? I misunderstood. My parents' neglect must have meant that something was wrong with me, not that they just were incapable of loving me. But of course, I egoically, as children do, turned it into I must be unlovable. Something must be wrong with me.
Can I
And so a lot of
interrupt?
us go to therapy with that.
Can I interrupt you on that one just for a
Mm,
moment? Because I just want to offer a different take on that, which is that yes, we do that narcissistically, just as you say, but actually that has a protective purpose. It's an
yeah,
adaptation because which is more dangerous for the child to assume that there's something wrong with me that maybe I can fix it and work on it, or that my parents are incapable of loving me.
yeah,
So even the belief that we're broken is a protective belief in some way. It starts off,
absolutely. And I don't think it's narcissistic. Narcissistic would never say I'm broken.
yeah,
They would never
yeah,
start there. The child of a
yeah,
narcissist would start at I am broken.
right,
um, but no, I mean egoically in the sense that all children, right at age 2, it's just psychological. We're learning about ourselves. It's not
yeah,
a bad thing. It's not a
yeah,
problem. It's a psychological phase of development, and especially when you get wounded there, you're going to internalize it.
yeah,
Um, Narcissism, I believe, stems later from that when you can no longer tolerate, that idea, and you have to say nothing's wrong with me. You can no longer, but I understand what you mean. Um, but that misunderstanding is a life changer, right? As you grow, we need to re-examine these thoughts, these beliefs that are fixed in us. As an adult, you hope to realize, oh, I wasn't unlovable. My dad didn't know how to love.
mm-hmm,
That changes it. It doesn't change your history. Your experience is still your experience, but it changes how you relate to your experience. And that's really powerful. Going back to my life wasn't all bad. My dad wasn't all bad. He wasn't all good. My own childhood wasn't just all trauma. There was also a lot of beauty, and making sure that I stay in relationship to the things that were good and not
mm,
just fixating on the things that were wrong. But with the brokenness, after the things happened with my mom, it was a doozy. I didn't trust any therapist. I didn't want anybody to touch my mind because I'd been brainwashed for pretty much my whole life. And I had tremendous anxiety, as you can imagine, and grief. And I was in the bathroom. I went into the sink to wash my hands, and I saw my image. And I remembered this allegory, I guess, of a statue. A warring village came, uh, a warring tribe came to invade a village, and the village covered a golden statue in mud to hide its value.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember which one it is. If you know the origin of it, I
No,
must have
I
read it
wonder.
somewhere.
I wonder if it's in Herodotus or somewhere, but I remember reading it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And the warring tribe came and left. They did
yeah,
not know the value of the statue. Years passed, and the villagers forgot
that's
in
right.
the aftermath about this golden statue, and they came to believe it was just an ugly statue
Mm-hmm.
there. A great storm came and revealed and washed away this mud, and people realized this statue was mud. For some reason, that story came crashing into my mind as I looked in the mirror,
Wow.
and I went, I'm not broken. I exist fully
Mm,
myself. You can't break it. It's physics. It's nature. It's I'm just covered in layers of shit and hurt and abuse and mud and bruises that aren't actually me. They're just experiences.
mm,
And so I began to approach this not like I'm broken or something's wrong with me. I just began to approach this like I'm whole. I exist whole all the time. And I
yes.
just have to find my way back to my wholeness. And it was this archaeological dig. And that's what helped me uncondition, recondition, get rid of my brainwashing. Because you have to realize I'd been taught lies since I was so young. Every single thing I thought about myself was a lot of it was false. And how do you know my own thought from a thought that was implanted in by somebody that was pretty sick? And the way I did it was by making an ally out of anxiety. And this was one of the most exciting things I think I've ever discovered. When I quit being at war with my hurt, with my pain, but I began to look at it as an ally and as a friend, because My anxiety is there to tell me I am not in agreement with something, a thought, feeling, or action in my environment. Just like with food poisoning, if I eat something bad and I throw up, it's my body's way of saying you can't consume that again.
Yeah.
So my anxiety was my body's way of
Exactly.
communicating that
Exactly.
something I was consuming did not agree with me. And I had
Exactly.
consumed poison my whole life. And so I began to look and flip that script of every time I was anxious. I remember being in a movie theater for some reason so vividly. My anxiety was skyrocketing and I didn't know why. But I left, I went out in my car, I got out my notebook and I went, what happened? What experience was happening?
Mm.
And I realized some scene in the movie triggered a thought, and that thought was not authentically who I was. It wasn't.
Mm.
And I was able to catch it, and I was
Mm.
able to write it down. And then I was able to tell myself the truth. And this is really different than, I'm not a huge fan of affirmative thinking
Neither am
because it
I.
has to be a deeper truth. You
Yeah.
can't lie to yourself, saying I'm the right weight to attract the right mate, or whatever it is. Like, it has to be a deep truth. And so
Yeah.
I realized there was this process, this archaeological process of self and other.
Yeah.
Self caused me to relax and dilate.
Yeah.
Other caused me to reject, right? It caused me to want to reject that thought, idea, feeling, interaction, relationship. And so I just started methodically writing it down again, going back to that listing of things. And then when a thought became really habitual, one that would send me over the edge was I don't know what I'm doing. That thought could paralyze me like no other thought could for some reason.
Mm.
And it's because I get it. I dealt with things I didn't know how to deal with from a really young age. The truth was, and it took me a long time to find the right antidote thought that neutralized that and the negative thought, was that I will learn. And
Yes.
I that makes my system right now just telling you through Zoom,
Yeah.
I relax, I will learn, and I don't give up. And I
Mm.
can trust that about myself. And so I learned the medicine to give myself to that poison thought and then to administer it constantly. And I used to make tapes for myself and I'd listen to them all night because my anxiety would skyrocket at my sleep too. I'd wake up having a panic attack. So that's a little bit about that archaeological dig.
Well, that's wonderful. So that leads me to two more questions. Um, One is, you talked about the poisons, that this anxiety, that some poison is entering you. Um, so it's a sign, it's just a friend rather than an enemy. And I was thinking about your chronic kidney problems, and I was wondering if you ever made this connection. But what's the job of the kidney? Is to remove poisons from the body.
Filter. Yeah.
And I just occurred to me that, like, had you come to me when I was first a physician, I just would have dealt with the physical aspects of it. You know, is there some blockage? What's the problem? What antibiotics do you need? Whatever. Had you come to me as a physician after I learned a few things, I might have said, what emotional poisons and toxins are you not clearing out of yourself that your kidney disease might actually represent? Have you thought of it that way?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That journey that I started when I was young to understand food as medicine, to understand my thinking on my physiology, I could tell right away it was affecting my physiology,
Yeah.
that it is affecting even my vascular system. It was affecting my ability to think cognitively, right?
Hmm.
Panic attack, as I learned later, takes your brain offline. All the blood drains out of your frontal lobes and your amygdala lights up and your cortisol lights up. So I had lived in this state for
Hmm.
years. But back then, there was no information about mind body connection, no information about, you know, the fact that I would be depleting myself minerally, even because of the
Yeah.
type of panic I was living under,
Right.
what it was doing to my blood pressure. And so, learning to advocate for myself medically was a huge part of my journey the entire time
Mm-hmm.
because I had doctors that were stretching my urethra. I mean, how inhumane is that? They thought maybe my bladder wasn't draining, and so they were
Yeah.
stretching and dilating my urethra, which was just torture,
Yeah.
to telling me that I was just crazy or making it up or putting me on antibiotics for a year at a time, things like this, which, intuitively, is just as a human, this isn't okay. I needed progesterone at age 28. Can you imagine that? Nobody was looking at my hormones. It was so much research I had to do to figure out what is going on in my body. It isn't right. Having doctors literally tell me I need therapy, which I'm sure I did. But
But
while
for
I was learning that, I also needed my liver wasn't converting T4 into T3, for example. So if you
yeah,
tested my blood, my thyroid levels looked good, but it wasn't going into my tissues. My
right.
hormones were in my bloodstream, but they weren't being absorbed, right? Now I have an absorption issue. That's a nutrition issue. It's an ability to dilate and take nutrition in,
Yeah.
emotional energy nutrition in. And so beginning to make those correlations, it was really this, I called it kind of this whole human, right? This whole human approach. All of these things are all interacting and affecting each other and having cross reactions, and learning to advocate medically and get the education I needed, and finding doctors that wouldn't just, say, okay, here's some
You
antibiotics. It took a tremendous amount. And one of the reasons I started my wellness experience that I have in Cincinnati is because I want what I had to go through to learn this, to find experts that could talk to me about absorption versus things just being in my bloodstream.
mhm.
It took my celebrity, believe it or not, because doctors can be incredibly hard to get a hold of.
No,
And I
I believe.
had to, sorry?
Unfortunately, unfortunately, I do believe you. And from my point of view, as a trained in Western medicine and having had my own learning journey, what's really remarkable and lamentable is that the things you're talking about now, the mind-body unity, the relationship of emotions to physiology, it's not airy-fairy new age stuff. It's actually science that's been documented over and over and over again. And so it's not even that what we call scientific medicine is in many ways very unscientific because it doesn't look at the scientific evidence. So what you're talking about, apart from being really good intuition, it's also pure documented science. So
Yeah,
it's just very frustrating how little that awareness seems to penetrate medical practice.
it is, especially when, as you say, the research is
Yeah,
out there.
yeah,
Um, just those things like dilated and contracted.
yeah,
If I could get my system to dilate, I just physiologically created a change in my body. My neurochemicals changed, my
yeah.
biochemicals changed, my dilation of my vascular system changed, and the blood flow patterns changed in my brain. That's
Mm-hmm.
documented. That's real things. And
Absolutely.
it is sad that I sort of have this tiny, I look at how we used to live in village culture, and we had a smaller container where we had access to our healers, and our healers were a very complete system. And it wasn't all siloed. Our children were mentored with us and educated with us. And as we, as a humanity, moved into urban environments, we fractured. We became schizophrenic because our healing got siloed into a building over here that was just our body. And then it further siloed where there was just a kidney specialist, and then just a heart specialist, and then just a liver specialist. And then our education got siloed out into a building over here. And then, oh my God, we have mental health problems. Still isn't very well done, but siloed out into over here. We disassembled our humanity as we became urban.
You know what? So what I'll
We
tell you,
paid a huge price.
what I'll tell you is that everything you said is stuff I touch upon. In fact, I dwell upon, not dwell upon, I explore deeply in my next book. And one of the things that I do talk about, but I want to ask you about because you just touched upon it yourself. Two things that seem to be very important to keep you on the healing track was nature, which is we're very cut off, but you seem very connected to nature from childhood. And at some point, you had some very powerful indigenous allies, indigenous teachers. So I think that in this urbanized society that you described, we've arrogantly turned our back on indigenous wisdom, and we've become very disconnected from nature, of course. And this is just because I love talking with you, but this is owing to time. This is going to be the second to last question I ask you, but can you just talk about that a little bit? Just about nature and indigenous wisdom in your own healing.
Nature taught me how to be a human.
Hmm.
It restored the naturalness to what had been sick in me and continues to do so.
Hmm.
Everything I learned about rhythm, a concept like the impermanence of thought and feeling, it's something you could Google. I learned that by watching the tide. And that's not because I'm
Hmm.
brilliant, it's because nature taught me. It's because I sat on
Hmm.
a cliff long enough to watch the ocean go out. And in Alaska, it takes 6 hours and to come back in with big tides up there. And it dawned on me, nothing is permanent in all of this nature I'm seeing around me. What would make me so arrogant as to think I'm the only thing in all of nature that would stay the same forever? How funny. And so the feeling that I'm having isn't forever. I just have to sit and let the tide go out. And that was my mantra. Sometimes the tide's just out. It'll come back in. And that's why I never killed myself. I was in some really tough spots, but that one lesson I learned from nature, I knew that feeling would last forever. Not everybody had that experience from nature. Not everybody knew the natural rhythm to things. And so they think that thought and that feeling is permanent. And if you're going to feel that way the rest of your life, why on earth would you want to stay here? I get it. And that's one of the biggest things we teach our kids. But I learned that from nature. Everything. Hardwood grows
Hmm.
slowly. And then pain. We're built for pain. We're built for it. We just forgot what to do with it.
Hmm.
As we got urbanized and as we became fractured and splintered, and as our humanity became decentralized, made schizophrenic, splintered, we lost knowledge, simple, traditional knowledge of what do you do with pain. We are
Yes.
built to deal with pandemics. We're built to deal with adversity. We are resilient. Nature is resilient. All resiliency is having multiple tools. So if there's a
Hmm.
drought, I have a plant that does good in a drought. And then if there's a flood, I have a plant that does good in a flood. That's if I'm
Hmm.
a forest. I'm speaking as the forest. And so emotionally, I have to be a forest. I have to have tools and learn tools, because if I only have a hammer, I'm going to have a very limited life and very limited experience life. But if I have all kinds of tools, I'm going to do better. And so every time I'm faced with a hardship, instead of getting mired in self reproach or shame, I just go, oh, I'm just being asked to evolve. I am being asked to learn a new tool. The quicker I can get to the curiosity of learning what that tool is, the better. And a great place to go is indigenous teachings. And I just wrote a song called What Did We Lose When the West Was Won?
Oh,
We were so quick to call
yeah.
these poor, brilliant souls savages when we were the people wiping them out with smallpox. Talk about savage. Because
Yeah.
they didn't wear clothing like we did. Because the healers talked about smokes and spinning wheels, which now we would call cells, and
Yeah.
illnesses that come in and out of them.
Yeah.
I have been so, I just am moved to tears that I don't even know how to express the gratitude. But my life has been changed forever for the better from the indigenous wisdoms that I've been able to learn and study. And I refuse to call where we're at progress if
Hmm.
we're this unhappy, if we're this sick, if we're this ill. We are not the most advanced society in history. If we're killing ourselves at record rates, we've really missed something. And our technology has outrun our philosophy. And I think the only way forward is by embracing and re examining a lot of the ancient and traditional wisdoms that we threw out.
Uh, Let me tell you the title of my next book. It's called The Myth of Normal: Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. I think
Beautiful.
I think this culture makes us sick, just for the reasons that you say. I'm going to come with one last question to you. Um, this is so hard for all of us. We all have this voice inside of ourselves. Uh, many people are not even aware of. It kind of sends signals sometimes. But you talk about it and you say that only we know when we're being true to the small and quiet voice that whispers from our soul. So this little voice that is inside, and the Bible talks about the small still voice. One of the prophets talk about it. Um, Talk about the small voice that's inside all of us, and how can we attend to it more mm, carefully and gratefully and wisely.
One of the great disservices that was done to us as humans was believing that only certain people were special and had access to
Mm,
God or healing or excellence.
mm,
You know, physics, fractal. If we really are a piece of God, then you have to take that all the way. We really
mhm,
are a piece of God.
mm.
And that axis mundi, that still point, that center, that nirvana, uh, was it Black Elk maybe who talked about it as the hoop? We all have access to that small still voice in us, whatever you want to call it. Even if you're atheist, you still have this still point in you that is quiet and it's easily drowned out, and the pace of our life and economy is really geared toward helping you drown it out. Because the less you know for yourself, the more you might pay someone else to know for you, which is so convenient. I get it. When I was little, my compass was so destroyed. I would have done anything for somebody else to tell me what the hell was right because I
Mm,
was so diluted. And that's a painful place to be. It's a painful place to be. But the more you can go inside yourself and cultivate a relationship with yourself, we go to school and we spend years and hours to learn whatever we want to learn, a skill, a math, a job. We spend hours dedicated to a career toward making money. We don't invest time in having a relationship with ourselves. And
yeah,
what's the point?
yeah,
We have to create a real actionable plan of I'm going to build a relationship with myself and I'm going to learn to build a relationship with the quiet voice in me. And I want to live my life by that voice. And it's like working out. You don't expect to be able to lift 200 pounds overnight. You just start with some time in the gym and maybe some stretching, and it'll come and go, and your dedication to it will come and go. But we all have that voice that we must cultivate because every day we make actions until the day we die. And those actions are based on something. And it's either going to be an unconscious voice, unconscious motivations, hurt, and pain that are prompting you, or it'll be based on a conscious, thoughtful voice that is prompting you. And it's the difference between a predestined, pre programmed world that you were trained as a young child versus autonomy, freedom, liberation. And it's not easy, it's not like a gimme, but it's our birthright to be happy. And if you're not happy, you need to do something about that. Nobody owes you happiness. You
mm,
owe yourself happiness. And that's exciting. And to make that commitment and to feel in your body like I am not going to die until I get my piece of happiness, and the world is conspiring for you to have it. It really is. It's a miracle how many miraculous doors will open in the darkest of desperations and situations that you think are impossible.
it's true. I mean, the society that we live in conspires against it, but the world conspires in favor of us. It's an interesting contradiction, but that's how it is. Jules, it's just wonderful to speak with you. Thank you. And I really got to know you reading your book this week, but this has been ever so much deeper and more intimate. So, and thank you for your own work. And I'm pretty sure that your artistic power in the world derives in significant part, well, from your talent for one thing, but also from you listening to yourself, listening to that voice, which I think you inspire other people to do as well. So thank you.
Likewise, that instinct, when you were fired, as you said, from your that one job,
Yeah,
for trusting that intuitive sense.
yeah.
People could look at you or look at me and think that it's special, and your gift is special, and I hope to cultivate my gift in a special way. But we all have that ability to have that intuitively led brilliance in an area that is unique to us and what we have to offer the world. And I hope everybody really knows that. And I want to tell you about my new book next time we talk, or maybe we can talk offline, because it sounds so in line with what you're writing.
Well, I love that
Looking
for
forward
sure.
to
Yeah,
it.
love that. When is your new book coming out?
I don't have a publisher yet. I'm just finishing my first draft of it, and
Okay, well,
yeah, I
let's
would
talk.
love your thoughts and feedback on it.
Just sure, I'd love that. Let's bring in Maurizio and Zaina to see if they have any questions. They're the stand-in for the audience here, so um, maybe they just want to bask in the glory of this interview, or maybe have some questions that you also want to ask.
But yeah, it just feels like such a complete, deep, intimate conversation that it's just a privilege to witness it.
Yeah.
I have a little question. I know we're running late. I don't know, Joe, if you have time for that.
I have about
It's
10
okay to
minutes
stop
for my
here as
next thing.
well. Just going back to the mother's wound, I feel like in our society, in the collective, it's shameful to speak about the bad mother. You almost as an archetype is not allowed, and somehow that perpetuates actually the wound, that us not being able to allow to voice and see the mother with her shadow, which as any human being we all have shadows, keeps perpetuating the wound. And just I wonder if you have something to say about that. And for me personally, being on a journey of healing my mother's wound, just recently, very immature realization. I was jumping very quickly to try to forgive her when I had so much rage and grief that I have never fully experienced and allowed. And I could feel that you so intimately gone the path of meeting the anger, meeting the grief of not having your needs met by your mother. If you have something
Beautiful.
to reflect on that.
Yeah, from zooming out a little bit, and you just sort of think about when religions began to turn man against nature, nature against God, women, femininity took a hit. Um, and so feminine power, feminine energy has been under attack, for quite a long time in history. And so it would make sense that our mothers, that our femininity, that our personal ability to mother well, to receive nurturance, whether we're male or female, to receive nourishment, whether we're male or female, this feminine principle would also begin to deteriorate in society, right? You're going to start seeing the side effects of a disempowered femininity, of feeling attacked, the feminine attacked, disempowered. And so it makes sense, that we're going to see more and more illnesses, more and more issues around that. Um,
Yeah.
there's also a huge burden that women carry, that we have to be one type of mother. In indigenous knowledge, there's at least four types of mother. There's a rainbow mother, a wisdom mother, a vision mother, and a crazy tooth mother. And they're all valid types of mothering. And crazy tooth mother doesn't sound like anything we recognize in our Western culture's mothering. It's kind of anti mothering, but there's wisdom in it. And not shaming women for not always being the perfect rainbow mother. Rainbow mother's kind of what we all wish we were and wish we had. It's kind of the mother that can mother anybody, any child, anybody that comes in. Um, and of course, there's empowered and disempowered versions of each of these, but there's also many more types of archetypal mothers. And so one is just as a woman finding what kind of woman you are and learning to be okay with it and embrace it and understand it in its empowered sense. How can I be the best version of it that I can be? Because not everybody's going to be an emotional, touchy-feely mom, and it doesn't mean you're an invalid mom. My mom's a different story. You know, my mom had some issues on top of whatever type of mother that she was. She had some type of illness. I'm not here to diagnose it, but I'm sure it didn't come from nowhere. And my job as a child was to learn to get healthy. And forgiveness, you know, as I said, has very little to do with that. That actually is kind of it's a control thing. Maybe if I forgive you, I'll get better and I can get over this. It also makes me feel powerful because I feel bigger now. I'm in a position of forgiving you. And I like that because it makes me feel doesn't make me feel so small and vulnerable. For me, it just, you know, when I talked about dilating, it was just, I had to dilate a lot, a long time during different phases to come to terms to really understand what happened to me. Because if trauma is an experience so big we can't understand it, we have to keep it fluid in our systems and we have to keep trying to understand it until we can allow it to move through us and our systems where we're like, I don't feel triggered by the thought of my mom anymore. You know, I used to think if I ran into her, I don't know what I would do. I would faint. I mean, it would terrify me. I don't feel that way anymore, you know, and you can tell it's progress. But it's a very personal thing and it's very for you. You know, it's not for them. It's not to forgive them. It's not to condone or not to condone. It's really an internal process of I want to be healthy. I want to understand my relationship to this. I want to resolve it. I want to let it move through my system. And that's a very intuitive process that there's no quick little fix for, sadly. And so it's spending a lot of time. I spend a lot of time. I spend about an hour a day in my own session in myself, my own session, my own field, in my body, in my hoop. And sometimes that comes up and I work with it, and other times it doesn't come up at all. I don't know if that helps at all.
Absolutely. No,
Absolutely.
thank you.
Thank you. So I know you have to run. I just want to tell you that your book touched us so deeply. It's the first time in 15 years of a relationship that we had two dinners in silence, listening to the audiobook of you. And that's
Wow.
happened before. And having you in person and hearing you speaking as good as what we heard. So
Yeah,
thank
Thank
it's
you,
deeply
deeply,
you.
thank you,
inspiring.
thank you.
And
Deeply inspiring.
you have such an
Well, it was
intimate
my honor,
way.
Core. I'm very appreciative of your time and of your work and your dedication to this, and look forward to more.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you,
Thank you,
Gabor,
Gabor.
for
Thank
this
you,
beautiful
Joel.
conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much. I'll see you down the road.
Thank you for your time.
Bye.